I'm super excited to do today's webinar. We're doing Kroger deduction office hours. So if you're just joining us, this topic's going to look a little bit different than our regular webinars. This is a time for you to ask all the questions you have around Kroger deductions with our expert, Ryan Petty. And that's a perfect segue into our next slide to introduce yourself, Ryan. You've worked here at Supply Pike for a very long time, basically since the conception of our company. And I'm really excited to hear from you and learn from all the knowledge you have to share on Kroger deductions.
Yeah, excited to share what I've learned and looking forward to hearing questions from the audience. And we've learned a lot from all of you and look forward to sharing back with you what we've picked up.
Yeah. And if you're new to webinars, my name is Allie Trong. I'm the lead content coordinator here, and I'll be teeing up the questions for Ryan. So don't make them too hard, but we'll be starting on the question portion just here in a second. Before we get into that, a couple of housekeeping things. First off, we're going to do a high overview of the basics, and Ryan and I are going to kind of tee up some topics we can have conversations about today, and then we'll jump into the extended Q&A and discussion section. So that's going to be the bulk of today's webinar. And then lastly, we'll get into a bonus demo of Deductions Navigator for Kroger, and Ryan will give us all the key information on that at the end. Another housekeeping thing is asking questions. So again, today's webinar is primarily a time for any participants to ask their questions about Kroger and Kroger deductions. So what's the best way to ask a question? So today we use the chat to have a conversation about scary movies, and that's perfect for conversation or adding in, how you have seen it as a supplier. If you get a lot of shortages from Kroger, put that in the chat. But when it comes to the Q&A, that's where I will be able to see your questions a little bit better. Usually the chat starts flying by. So if you put it in the Q&A, it'll save it there for me, and I'll be able to get your question to Ryan so we can answer it here today. And then lastly, if you are new to our webinars, or if you're not sure what Supply Pike is, Supply Pike is the company that we belong to, and we create cloud-based tools that help CPGs maximize their cash flow and minimize revenue loss. And we do that with a couple different tools that we've created, one of those being Deductions Navigator for Kroger. So it helps suppliers resolve retail compliance issues and actually allows you to dispute those compliance issues or deductions. And with that, we'll go ahead and get into today's content. We're going to kind of start at a high level of what Kroger deductions are, and specifically we'll touch on Kroger AP deductions. We will get a little bit into what some of the AR deduction space looks like, but again, we're going to focus on AP or accounts payable Kroger deductions. All right, so from a high level, Kroger deductions, where can they be found? You're going to go into your Levante portal, which I'm sure everyone is aware of, because all Kroger suppliers have access to this. This portal, kind of similar or different than other retailers, it was actually created by PRGX. And the Levante portal serves a couple different purposes, with some of those being able to view your Kroger deductions, dispute your Kroger deductions, see your payments from Kroger, and view your supplier invoices. And then deductions are going to be associated with a particular supplier invoice. So you're always going to have a deduction matching to your supplier invoice. So there wouldn't be one just sitting out on the side, not tethered to a supplier invoice. And each of these deductions will have basic information that contains, the UPC, the item description, deduction amount and quantity, the deduction code, and deduction description for each particular supplier invoice and deduction. And just to kind of level set on what a deduction is, when we say the word deduction, we mean a withheld payment by Kroger. So that can come in a couple different forms in terms of it could either be a whole amount or it could be a portion of a payment. All right. And then here are the high level claim codes that you're going to see listed on deductions. And it's going to fall into a couple different categories. So you've got your code 2 and code 3, which are more tied to your promotional allowances. Code 3 is tied to a cost difference. So it's going to be the difference between the unit price of what was billed to Kroger and then versus what Kroger expected to pay per unit. And then code 4 and code 6 kind of get lumped together because these codes are both on shortages. So a shortage is going to be when, Kroger, you meant to ship Kroger 10, but they come back and say, nope, you only shipped me 4 or 8. And then 7s are overages, which is kind of the opposite of that. And there are occasions where you can actually get a shortage and an overage in the same supplier invoice, because you're seeing, you shipped a similar item and you're actually getting billed for the overage on that similar item versus the original item you're being shorted for. So you can actually see these codes kind of start to layer on top of each other and tell a story of what happened, whether that is valid or invalid. And then you also have codes 8 and code 9. So code 8 is for net total dollar difference, and then code 9 is for pickup allowance. And I wanted to give Ryan some space here to add any context for either the codes or some of the acronyms for the different claim types.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. And I think you stated it well, just calling out a few sort of nuances here. Over on that right side is the claim type column, and that's the suggested claim type that we suggest you select if you are going to dispute one of these deduction codes on the left. You don't necessarily have to, but Kroger, if you pick the wrong claim type when you're submitting a dispute, then they can kick it back to you and say, you need to update this, or they might even outright reject the dispute. And sometimes that sort of timeline can be months before they give you that update. So, you can waste a lot of time if you don't have the right claim type selected over on the right side. So the right side is what we have seen typically used with those codes on the left, even though Kroger doesn't really publicize this. This is what we've learned from a lot of different disputes. One other sort of note, the code 6s and code 7s we often see kind of intertwined. So especially if you say bill for item number 123, and maybe you don't have that packaging available at the time, so you ship the same item, but maybe it's in cases of 12 instead of 6. So you ship item number 124 instead. So what Kroger will sometimes do is short the 123. They'll say, we didn't receive any of item number 123. So you get a code 6 shortage deduction. And then for the item 124 that you did actually ship and they did receive, they'll create an overage and pay you for that item. And sometimes the code 7 positive amount will offset the code 6, sometimes completely, sometimes partially. And then sometimes you may see code 6s without a code 7 as well, but just kind of want to call out, sometimes those 6 and 7s can be related. So if you see those codes on the same invoice, try and compare those. And then lastly, the code 8 is an interesting one, because basically Kroger says, we don't know if there's a pricing or a unit shortage. They just know that whatever you billed them and what they received seems to be different in some way. So you kind of have to do some legwork to understand, was there a shortage issue that caused the deduction? Was it a wrong price that was billed that caused the deduction? And sometimes this can be down to units. Like if you build, say, for cases, but they were expecting eaches, then they might, pay you based on eaches rather than cases, or sleeves versus packs type of scenario. So anyways, I'm sure we may get into some of those scenarios a little bit more, but just a little bit of color on some of those issues.
Yes, thank you for that, Ryan. And I did kind of want to loop back to something you said. We keep saying Kroger, but for any retailers that kind of fall under the Kroger family, so your Fred Meyers or any retailers like that, these codes also apply, correct?
Exactly. Yep. This and Levante itself is generally for all of Kroger's banners. So any of the deductions with any of their banners, Ralph's Roundies, Fred Meyers, etc., would apply to our topics here today.
Perfect. All right, and then kind of to bounce off of the last slide, here are some of the dispute proof that some of the conversations we've had with other suppliers, and some of the research that our teams have done have resulted in, and we can kind of come back to the slide when we get into the different codes and how to dispute them, or if they're typically disputed or not. But this is just a quick call out, and I can also pause here if people want to screenshot this later. Again, we'll send the deck in the follow-up email, but I just wanted to pause here to give a little context. And then, as promised, I said that we'd talk a little bit about what AP deductions versus AR deductions looks like. So when I'm saying AP, I mean accounts payable and then accounts receivable. So AP deductions can be specifically identified in the associated deductions table when viewing invoice details, and then conversely, accounts receivable fines from Kroger will also be viewed in Levante, but they will show up as invoices in Levante. And again, we're going to focus on AP deductions, but since Ryan's here, we can also kind of tee up some of those AR questions as well. A couple things to know before we get into the Q&A portion. Deductions can be valid, meaning suppliers would hold responsibility. Yes, I did ship 8 when you asked for 10, Kroger, or they can be invalid. And that means that you should go in and dispute those claims. Kroger suppliers have 180 days to dispute invalid deductions, which is a little bit smaller than some of the other retailers like Walmart, in terms of a dispute window. And you're similar or different rather than other retailers where you're working with directly with the company. Kroger actually outsources to PRGX, the company that built the platform, and they host the website, and their employees actually respond to Kroger supplier disputes. Then another quick table on the resolution time. So this is typically what we see for some of the suppliers that we work with. Unpaid invoices are usually paid back in about 30 to 45 days. Shortages, ORAD, late deliveries are 90 days, as well as list costs off invoice and cash discounts. So actually pretty speedy time compared to some other retailers. And with that, Ryan, we're going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A session. And the first question I have for you is based on some of the recent news. So just to catch everyone up, if they haven't seen, Kroger actually acquired Albertsons. And I wondered if you have any ideas of how this will affect deductions, both in Albertsons and in Kroger.
Yeah, so very recent news. And I think specifically they're sort of both companies are in agreement to make the acquisition possible. I think there'll be some sort of federal review of that process, just to see if that merger or acquisition can go through. So it could still be quite a while before we actually see that sort of officially happen, but both companies appear to be in agreement. So in terms of deductions and how it could play out, one thing that we have seen is, say, with Amazon and Whole Foods. Amazon acquired Whole Foods several years ago, and one thing that we've noticed with that acquisition is that both if you're a vendor to both, say, retailers, they still have their own portals, their own processes for deductions and disputing. They did not combine their accounting from that perspective. They kept Whole Foods separate from Amazon. We don't know for certain how Kroger and Albertsons will approach the process change, but given that both are quite large and probably have some mature processes, I wouldn't be surprised if they continued to stay separate. That said, though, Kroger has acquired a number of banners over the years, which is why they have all those, weird names across the country, depending on where you live. And, to this point, Kroger has brought them into Levante. So it is possible that Kroger, as the acquiring party, could bring Albertsons into Levante, and deductions start to go through that process. But I believe this might be the largest kind of acquisition Kroger has made, so this could be treated differently. So a little bit TBD, kind of speculating. I would guess that if an acquisition does happen, that there would be a transition period that would take some time if they were being brought in to Kroger's existing portals and data structure. So I think it'd be a ways out before any Albertsons deduction changes, but it's possible. So definitely something to keep an eye out for.
Yes, I agree. And we actually had someone write in Albertsons receiving so many deductions. And my question to you, Ryan, if those processes, whether they remain separate from Kroger or Albertsons processes are kind of folded into Kroger's Levante portal, do you feel like Supply Pike will be taking on a solution for that?
So definitely, if they bring their deductions into Levante, then it would be great. Supply Pike is already set up to sort of handle those deductions and help you identify and dispute those deductions. If they keep Albertsons separate, we already have kind of broad solution for all retailers that we can help with that deductions and disputing process. So I think either way, we're set up great. If they combine it into Kroger, then you can see everything in one spot. Otherwise, if they keep it separate, Supply Pike still has tools to help you really gather those shipping documents and fight those deductions much more easily. So either way, I think we're set up pretty well.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds about what I was thinking as well, Ryan. And yeah, I think they are still using their own portals. So we'll see if anything changes. We will keep everybody updated. With that, could you talk a little bit about the code 8s? And I'll kind of flip back to this page here and you can tell me if I need to go somewhere else as well. The code 8 deductions.
Yeah, so Kroger has some very specific and probably the most documentation on this one code compared to everything else. But essentially, they call the description net total dollars difference because they don't really know, and they explicitly state, they don't know if the reason for how much they expect to pay versus how much they were billed, they don't know if the reason for that difference is related to the number of units that was shipped or if it was a pricing issue. And usually this is because whatever unit you build Kroger for, they expected something different and or received something different. And so that it's potentially the same item, but it's a different unit. Again, like packs versus sleeves, or we've seen for cases versus pounds. If you sometimes ship certain food products are listed in pounds as opposed to eaches or something like that. So if that's usually where we see this code 8 apply is when there's a difference in the unit type that was billed and what Kroger expected to pay or what they received. And so, they'll pay you based on what they either ordered or received. And if that ends up being a different amount than what you billed them for, then they'll say, well, you billed me for 800, we're going to pay $750. So there's a $50 deduction. And we don't know, the cause of that. We don't know if you ship the right amount of units. We don't know if you build at the right price. So really you have to then look at your invoice, look at the item that they deducted, and try to figure out, and you may want to look at the purchase order as well to see what unit Kroger actually ordered. Compare that to your invoice. And essentially, you want to try to figure out, did I get paid everything that I should have based on what I actually shipped to Kroger and the price for that item? Did I get paid what I should have? That's kind of the legwork you have to do. And if not, then you might have to determine, okay, did they miscount how much I received or how much they received? Or was the price that Kroger was paying at wrong in their case? And you can dispute that. And so it does require a bit of legwork. And so once you do that legwork though, and if you figure out, okay, they under received, they undercounted what they received, then you can use the shortage claim type. If it determines to be a pricing issue, then you can use that list cost claim type. So we see a mix when codates are disputed by suppliers. More commonly, we see suppliers use the shortage claim type, but we also see companies that are disputing based on a price difference of, disputing the fact that it was a wrong price, and that would be using the list cost claim type. So it's really just that legwork of reviewing the PO, the invoice, the item that was deducted, and determining if you were paid in full or not. And then, was it shortage or price related? So unfortunately, it's a bit of research to figure out those codates. So that tends to be one of the trickiest ones.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've seen across the board from other suppliers is code 8s, and there's another one in there, I believe. Well, when it comes to just the amount, it's those shortage ones. So either your code 6 or your code 4, or kind of a amalgamation of the two. Since we're on the topic of deductions and disputing, what are some of your best tips you have for suppliers who are trying to dispute Kroger deductions?
Well, it's a great question. I would, say a few things. Number one, I would recommend disputing earlier rather than later. We talked about the 180-day dispute window that Kroger Suppliers has. That's one of the tighter windows out of some of the big retailers that we have worked with and work with suppliers on. So it's a tight window. And the other thing is, we talked about the resolution times of what Kroger publishes. What we've seen on average is about that. We've seen around 80 days in terms of how long Kroger takes to respond to your dispute. And so the thing is, if you try once and dispute, you can dispute again, but only if you are still in that 180-day dispute window. So if you waited 3 or 4 months and then you dispute once and they reject it because you're missing some information or you didn't select the right claim type, and then they get back to you 3 months after you submit that claim, then basically you're out of the window and you lose the opportunity to dispute again. So I would really encourage to dispute at least in the first 2 months after a deduction is created, so that you give yourself that second chance to correct any issues on the first dispute. And of course, ideally, you can fill out the dispute and have everything you need on the first try. But if not, you give yourself a little bit of second chance if you do it, if you're disputing fast enough. Mm-hmm. So we talked about the dispute proof on the next slide. I might just call out a few documents that I think are really important for certain deduction types. But for shortages, the shipping documents are going to be the most important document that you can attach on shortage deductions. Ideally, you have a proof of delivery that has been stamped by Kroger. That's sort of the, gold standard of disputing a shortage, is you have a proof of delivery with a stamp from the Kroger DC based on them receiving that delivery. And that's, if you're prepaid and you're doing live unloads, then your carrier should have that kind of documentation. If you're doing a drop trailer scenario, then you may only have a sort of drop trailer stamp. And it may be harder to get that proof of delivery that's been stamped by Kroger. You should still be able to get a proof of delivery, but it may not have been stamped. So, if that's all you have, I would still recommend submitting the dispute, especially if you think it's invalid. But just know that they might come back and ask for the stamped POD. Another sort of alternative to that, you can also contact the Kroger DCs. And sometimes when we talk to suppliers who are seeing maybe a very large invalid shortage that they really want to get reversed, they will actually contact the Kroger DC and request a proof of delivery from that DC so that they can attach it to their dispute. So that might be something that you try if there's a particular sort of significant charge that you want to get reversed. If you're a collect supplier where Kroger's coming to your facilities and picking up, then often the only documentation you have is the signed bill of lading. So, again, if that's all you have, I would still say go ahead and submit. It might be that scenario. The only thing you might consider is if it is a larger charge, or if you submit it once and they don't accept the signed bill of lading. As long as you've done it, early enough, you have that secondary chance. You might have to reach out to the Kroger DC to get the stamped POD. So just kind of remember that as always sort of a fallback tactic. That's the best documentation you can get. But if you don't have that, you can still dispute. We've still seen some reversals without that. It just seems like sometimes they're a little bit inconsistent. Sometimes they really want the stamped POD. So, do your best to get it. But if you don't have it, I would still recommend disputing, and you still have a chance at getting that reversed. So for shortages, that's really important. For, say, price differences. A lot of times those code 3s, we see those happen around the time of items prices being changed to Kroger. So if you're going to dispute one of those where they took a deduction, you don't think it's valid, maybe they were paying at the old price instead of the new price that you established. If you're going to dispute that, ideally, you would have a copy. Part of that price change process is getting approval from the buyer or the merchant at Kroger. So if you're going to dispute, you want that email approval from Kroger saying the price change could go into effect. So you'd want to attach that ideally. And then, of course, a copy of your invoice so you can show what you actually billed. So that's really important documentation for those. Code 9s, the pickup allowances, those are related to, if you are collect and Kroger comes and picks up the freight, they will basically take this allowance to charge for the transportation. And you can dispute that. Sometimes we see it as invalid because maybe you do a mix of prepaid and collect, and they'll incorrectly take the pickup allowance. And so if you actually transport it yourself, if you were to include, say, a POD from your own carrier, then you can prove that, you delivered that PO and not Kroger. Sometimes we've also seen them take the wrong rate. So they charge a certain rate based on, your goods or how far they're traveling. And sometimes they are charging a different rate. So you can potentially dispute that as well. But yeah, I know that's not all the codes that you can get, but I think for sort of a lot of the major ones, that's some of the most important stuff to collect and use on your dispute. And just the other general best practice is dispute as quickly as you can so you can get a second chance at redisputing if you needed to.
Yes. One thing I love to call out too, we had another Kroger webinar where everyone was really shocked by this tip. So the difference between a question and a comment. So you'll have to help me tease out the difference because I'm forgetting. But essentially one of them kind of floats in the ether and no one reads it, but the other triggers a response from a team on the PRGX side.
Yeah, exactly. It is quite strange. So when you submit, you can submit comments on a deduction itself, your invoice payment where you're viewing the deduction. You can also submit comments on your claims, those disputes you're filing with Kroger. And I definitely, recommend using this for specific instances where you need more information or clarification. I've even seen Kroger actually attach backup material that's helpful to understand, the reason for the deduction. So comments can definitely be useful. The weird or tricky thing about it is when you submit a comment, you select a comment type and you get an option of comment, just general comment type, or question. And it says like public comment, private comment, public question. So if you use public comment, Kroger and PRGX can see that, but they're not notified. So their personnel, are reviewing disputes that have been submitted, all day long. They're looking at sort of their queue or their task list of what they're going down. But when you submit a comment, that does not like bubble your dispute up or your deduction up to the top of their list. It really doesn't do anything. It just means that when they access that particular page, they can see the comment. Whereas inverse of that, if you submit a public question, then they actually get a notification that you have submitted something on that particular deduction or dispute. And at that point, it's kind of expected that they will answer that question at some point. They may not be super timely, but it at least sort of puts it on their task list. And generally, we see those questions answered eventually. So I would definitely encourage you, if you want a response from Kroger or Levante, then use that public question comment type.
Thank you for teasing that out for us. That blew a lot of people's minds on the last Kroger webinar we did. So I wanted to make sure I brought that up again. And then another question we had about deduction codes. Where exactly on Levante can you see deduction codes?
So when we're talking about the deductions taken off one of your invoices, a supplier invoice, then where you would spot that is in Levante. You can go to transactions payments to see all the payments that Kroger has made on your invoices. And then if you open up that, you can search by invoice number or payment number, and then you can open up an individual invoice payment to go to that details page. And on that details page, there's a little table called associated deductions. And that is sort of the second thing on that page. At the top, it'll show just basic invoice and payment info. And then the second thing on that page, in that detail page, is associated deductions. And that'll list out, I think on one of these earlier slides, we talked about each deduction line contains the UPC, the item description, the code, the amount that was deducted. So yeah, right there. So that's in that associated deductions table on the invoice payment. That's where you'll see this deduction information. So yeah, if they're deducting because of something going on with your own invoice, that's where it will be listed. We talked about the AR charges, and those are sort of Kroger invoices where they're kind of billing you. And so those would be in a different spot. But the deductions would be right on that invoice payment.
Perfect. And kind of segueing into some of the more AR charges and other things in the compliance space for Kroger. Could you share some of the on-time delivery rules and the penalties for not following those at Kroger?
Yeah. So, they're really So there's two primary kind of on time in full related defect types, so to speak. So if you are late on delivery, then you can get, they refer to their program as ORAD, which stands for Original Requested Arrival Date. But if you are late, basically to when that order is due, then they will create an AR charge. They'll bill you for sort of non-compliance of delivering late on that particular PO. So that's one scenario that can happen if you're late. They do not seem to issue it if you are early. And that's something that differs actually from other retailers, say like Walmart, where if you deliver early, you get fined just as much as if you were late. With Kroger, we typically just see that on the late side. These are usually $500 fees, although sometimes I've seen some other sort of charge amounts, but usually it's a $500 fee. And then the other common ORAD related charge or on time in full related charge is case fill fine. And so if they've ordered, a certain number of units, and then you only ship less than that, then you're kind of subject to a potential case fill fine, to where, they will charge you for not filling the order in full. And for whatever reason, we see a lot more late shipment charges than case fill fines. So I don't know if that just means that Kroger has some additional leniency related to being in full, where maybe they are forgiving some of those scenarios. But with on time, they do not seem to have as much forgiveness. They're issuing the late shipment charges regularly. Case fill fines we do see, just not quite as often as those late loads. But yeah, you would find all of those compliance charges in the AR charges. So in Levante, you can go to transactions invoices, and then that's where you can spot Kroger invoices or charges that have been charged back to you. That's where those ORAD charges would be.
Perfect. And then a question that came in while you were talking about this particular topic, is the claim window for non-compliance charges still the same in that 180 days?
Yes, good question. It is the same 180-day window, and it's based on when the payment, it's based on the payment date that the charge was taken off of. So whenever Kroger issues a payment to you, they are typically paying multiple invoices of your invoices, and then they may also apply their own sort of chargebacks to that overall payment amount. That's what they call this netting process, where they're taking their chargebacks and applying it to a payment. And so whenever they apply that ORAD charge to a payment, then based on that payment date, that's what starts the 180-day window for these compliance charges to be able to dispute. And you would go to that invoice payment to submit that dispute if you wanted to.
Gotcha. And you actually got to my next question. You alluded to it. Can you explain a little bit more in depth that netting process?
Yeah. So definitely has confused a lot of suppliers and us too at times. But what it seems to be is, Kroger is, when they go to pay, they are looking at, okay, what is owed by Kroger at that time? What are outstanding invoices need to be paid? And then they're also looking at chargebacks that they have issued. So these could be post-audit charges, returns, compliance charges that we talked about. There's promotional allowances as well that can be issued. So any type of AR chargeback that they have created their own invoice, they're looking at those as well. And then they're going to balance that, what sort of they feel is owed to them versus what they owe to you, and sort of sum those up into a total payment amount. And that is the sort of netting process. So something that we see sometimes happen is, you get a $0 check, which doesn't seem very exciting from Kroger. But your invoice is paid, quote unquote. They are potentially paying your invoice in full, but they've not given you any actual funds because they've said, well, we are subtracting these chargebacks that we've issued that are maybe unrelated to your invoice, but they happened around the same time, and they've netted those chargebacks against what they owe to you. And that may result in kind of a partial payment of your invoices. It could result also in a literal $0 payment. You should still get that payment data via EDI, and you can, dig more into the details of that payment. You can actually kind of reconcile and sort of see the ledger of all the, payables and all the receivables that they applied to that one payment in Levante, and see how they came up with the math. But yeah, it can result in kind of $0 checks, and you have to then do the due diligence of, okay, is this expected? Are any of these charges invalid? Do I want to dispute any of them, etc., if you're not getting paid in full? So lots of fun work there when that happens.
Yeah. And you did kind of speak to the accuracy. So when you're trying to check the accuracy of your netting, is it coming down to just diving into EDIs and looking at ledgers, or are there other tips there for ensuring that when you're in the netting process that it is accurate and you are required to pay that total?
Yeah, so you may, depending on your system and how you're receiving the EDI, it may be easier to do this kind of legwork and research into a particular payment in your own system, or you can do it in Levante. It's not necessarily easy, but you can technically do it. So what I would do is if you received maybe a $0 payment, you can go into Levante, into transactions, and then payments. You can look up that payment reference number, and you can see all of the supplier invoices that were paid with that payment. You can click on one, and then at the bottom of that payment details is a list of associated transactions. And that is basically the ledger of all the payables and all the receivables that were combined into this overall payment amount. So you can see which of your invoices were paid by this payment and which charges were applied to that payment from Kroger. And then you can actually click on any of those individual invoices or charges to review the details of what that charge was. And sometimes you have to kind of do that like one by one, which is super painful, just to see what those charges are. You can export the list of charges, but it doesn't really give you sort of, transaction level root cause in that export. So if you really want to dig and understand why was this, $500 charge issued to me and reduced payment on this check, you kind of have to click on that transaction and then try to view the details of it to see what caused it, and then repeat that for any charge on that payment that you want to investigate. So it can be done, just a little bit of a tedious process.
Yes, 100%. And I'm going to kind of transition again back to the difference between AP and AR charges and deductions. And Ryan, is determining the difference of that in Levante just simply looking in different areas, or are there other ways to distinguish I'm receiving an AP or an AR charge?
Yeah, so there's a couple things you can do. Number one, and kind of maybe the easiest thing to remember, is if you see an invoice number that does not look like your invoice, then that is probably a Kroger AR charge. They often have like a combination of letters and numbers, maybe starts with 092, but not always. They can be, 10 or 12 digits long. But they, after you've reviewed Kroger charges for a while, you kind of can pick them up pretty quickly. But basically, if you don't recognize the invoice number, if it's not yours, then it's probably Kroger's. And that means it's a Kroger chargeback where they've billed you for some reason. If it's an invoice number you recognize and it's yours, then you know that's not a chargeback. And so that's one way. There is also a filter in Levante called invoice category, and you can kind of filter between DSD and warehouse invoices. And that would be like, show me all my supplier invoices for goods that were shipped to the store or to the warehouse. There's other categories for promotional allowances and non-promotional allowances. And those two categories would typically be Kroger chargebacks. So one other sort of tip, you can use that invoice category filter to try to differentiate, or just use the rule of, if you don't recognize the invoice number, it's probably a Kroger AR charge.
Perfect. That's super helpful. And then I think we have time for one more question, and I'm gonna go to everyone's favorite topic, getting paid. So how can I, as a supplier, view how my dispute is moving through the process? And then how can I expect to see my payment show up?
Yeah, so that is a good topic. I thought you might go back to Halloween movies, but we'll stick with getting paid. So yeah, when Kroger expects invoices to be submitted via EDI. That is their definitely sort of requirement. You can upload invoices manually to Levante, but they may issue a code 5 deduction if you've not submitted that invoice via EDI. So typically suppliers are sending in invoices via EDI. That obviously starts the process. You want to make sure that Kroger accepts that invoice, that EDI transaction. Hopefully your EDI partner or department in your own company has ensured that all of those transactions are flowing through correctly. So usually that's not the issue. So once Kroger has successfully received the invoice, and based on your payment terms, they will make a payment, typically towards the end of that payment term. And you can see your invoice in Levante even before it is paid. So if you've submitted it and you're wondering if they paid it yet, you can go into Levante, into transactions, and then invoices, and you can search by invoice number or date, and click on your invoice. And if there is a payment, you'll see it in this associated payments table. So it's another kind of table of information. There's one called associated payments. So if there's a payment, then you can click on that payment and see the details of when they made it, what the payment number was, what the payment amount was, all of that. And if there is no payment, then that would typically mean they have not paid that invoice yet. And you can submit claims on unpaid invoices. So you could open up your invoice and create a claim off of it to say, this has not yet been paid. Or you can submit that public question if you want to try to kind of escalate it that way. So sometimes we see suppliers have to do that to get their invoices paid. Hopefully that's not an issue for most of you on the call. But if it is, then submitting a claim or submitting a public question would probably be, the first two lines of defense to try to get paid. You may have more luck with the claim, but you could also even try both. So hopefully that helps anybody who's kind of waiting on payment from Kroger.
Yeah, that is helpful. And with that, we're gonna go to our last slide here. Thank you again, Ryan, for answering all those questions. And thank you to all the participants who wrote in some really great questions today. If you have any other questions after the webinar, you can contact us. These are our real emails, or you can find us at supplypike.com and you can look into our solutions, but you can also navigate to our educational arm called Supplier Wiki, which has lots of great webinars like the one you're on that are recorded, as well as articles and ebooks and even in-person events if you're here in Northwest Arkansas. So go ahead and check that out. Otherwise, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can get into our demo.
Awesome. Well, let me get my screen shared here. So we wanted to give you a peek at SupplyPike's take on Kroger deductions. So if any of you use our Deductions Navigator solution for other retailers, you should see a lot of similarities here. We've tried to create kind of one experience to manage your deductions across retailers. So we've just got our kind of demo company here, and I'll give you a tour of, the main pages of the app and what we're trying to do. Please ask any questions you have, but so we're starting out. We've got our deductions dashboard, and the purpose of this is to give you kind of clear visibility and reporting and some insights into where your deductions are coming from. So you can see things like how much in total deductions you've received, how much is actionable, which means how much is still in the dispute window and not yet disputed. You can see other, information about in terms of dispute success, how much have you had sort of won and what's your claim win rate. You can also see the dollars broken down by status. So how much has been, again, not disputed, how much is maybe kicked over to Kroger and you're waiting on Kroger to review that dispute, paid, denied, as well as expired amounts of deductions or deductions that you've marked as, kind of you've cleared them. You're not going to dispute them. You can also do that in our system. So you can either clear or dispute every deduction. That's the goal, is to help you quickly sort of manage these deductions as they are occurring across all the Kroger banners. So some additional insights you got here. You can see a breakdown by deduction code, where these deductions are coming from in terms of volume as well as dollar amount. You can see some additional breakdowns like, deductions over time, by division, if there's certain Kroger divisions where you're receiving these more often. You also can see it by item. So sometimes this is helpful, especially say for pricing deductions. If you're getting a lot of those, you can kind of see which items are receiving those the most, as well as, any ones that in terms of shortages, which of your items are having problems with that particular deduction type. So some insights into your deductions that you certainly do not get in Levante. It's hard to kind of roll up all of that deduction data to get this insight. So that's what we've tried to do here. Should mention real quick, you can also filter this entire page for certain date ranges. So if you wanted to do year to date, the last 3 months, you can update the dashboard and all this information would update. So that's the sort of high level deductions dashboard. We also have this kind of list view where you can manage your individual deductions. You can see all the deductions by different statuses. So those that have not yet been disputed, that you can dispute, those that are in progress, where you're waiting on Kroger's response, and then finally, deductions that have kind of reached their end status. So you can look up those, ones that were paid back, or look at the ones that were denied and review those. So there's a lot of different search and filter capabilities. You can search by, invoice number, by payment number, by PO number, UPC number. So all those things you can kind of search and filter the deductions by right here. You also have filters like dispute readiness. And so this is where you can quickly filter your deductions that have not yet been disputed to those where these deductions have all of the recommended proof documentation. So I talked about like shipping documents are key to disputing shortages. This filter would filter the list of deductions to those where a shipping doc on a shortage deduction is attached and it's ready to be disputed. So in essence, it's just trying to tee up the deductions that are ready to be disputed based on them having the correct proof or backup documentation. So there's other filters, of course. You can filter to just certain, say, deduction codes, specific statuses, and more, date range, certain divisions, etc. So that's the list view. You also can export out this whole list, either all deductions or a particular kind of bucket. And you can do that at this sort of deduction level or at the line level. So if you want item level exports of your deductions, then that's what this would allow you to do. And then lastly, the last page is kind of our deduction detail page where you can see all of the details about this deduction. So we kind of break it out to bubble up the most important information. How much is the deduction for what items? You've got all the basic details like the invoice, PO, payment data, check amount, how much was paid on that invoice. And then we also kind of pre-fill a dispute form for you so you can submit disputes directly from SupplyPike. So we would auto fill in the deduction amount. We'd auto fill in the claim type based on our best practices that we've learned. If you set up a shipping document integration with us, we can actually automatically pull in your shipping documents and tie them to this particular deduction so that it's ready to be disputed pretty much immediately. And then all you have to do is kind of review and submit. You can also archive it and say, this is a valid deduction, I want to clear it. You can add notes to keep track of what you've researched on this deduction. And so that is sort of the individual deduction detail page. And obviously, if this was a in progress dispute, you'd see the information on that in progress dispute. If it was paid back, you'd see how much you were paid, etc. And the last thing I'll mention is that there are also kind of bulk actions that you can do in our app. So if you had, say, 5 shortages that you wanted to dispute, everything was ready, you could just select those 5 and click on submit disputes, and all 5 would be submitted immediately. You can do other things like bulk archive, bulk update the claim description. So try to do everything we can to streamline that disputing process, pull in your shipping documents, your invoices automatically, and sort of queue up these deductions to be disputed. So, Allie, hopefully that was a good rundown of SupplyPike's take.
Yes, that was perfect. And I did want to point out 2 things. This solution we have is in Kroger as well as Walmart, Target, and now Amazon. Yay, we launched that a couple weeks ago. As well as if you're interested in using this solution, we offer a free trial. So knowledge is power. If you want to see how your deductions are doing across different retailers that I mentioned before, you have at least a week or a 2-week period around there to look at that and actually be able to dispute through the app. So with that, Ryan, anything else that you would like to add?
No, thanks everyone for attending, and enjoy your spooky or not spooky movies.
Yes. Take care, everyone. Have a great Tuesday.